Welcome. This session is the number 4 on the focal framework metadata layer. I recommend you look at the previous sessions to get a more complete understanding. In the previous session, we looked at how you can document the focal logical model and its relations to the physical implementation in the metadata layer's semantic model. In this session, we will look on how you can document other models in the semantic part in the metadata layer. In the agenda today, we will look on how the semantic model in the metadata layer is set up to have the ability to capture almost any model. We will look at an example how a business information model can be represented and how it relates to a focal logical model. Then we will have a look at an example on how source models can be represented. This is how the semantic model captures any model. We first have a focal representing the overarching model that we want to document. Here we can capture the name of the model and all other kinds of descriptive information that we want to have. Then we have a focal representing entities that are within the model we are documenting. So there will be a relationship between the model in this case and the different entities that are within that model. And then we have a focal for attributes. And we can then by that set up relationships between the entity focal and the attribute focal to describe what attribute belongs to what entity. We also have a focal for domains, and by that relationship with the attribute focal, we can describe what domain an attribute is using. And if there are values within that domain that have their own meaning and definition, we can capture them as well in the domain value focal. To make something clear, we don't care if the model is a physical data model or a file sent by a source or a JSON structure sent through a REST API which we are accessing to capture data, or simply a logical business information model. They all fit in this structure. They all represent a model of some kind. They all contain a structure which we see as an entity. This structure contains columns or fields or attributes, etc., to represent data. These attribute uses domains to represent data, and some of these domains contains values with their own definition. We capture these models for the purpose of semantic representation, and not to generate physical models or such. It's only for a semantic purpose. It is the ability to capture names, definition, descriptions, and maybe rules as well of the model. When building a focal data warehouse, you don't need to use the focal model or the entity focal. They are optional, but attribute focal, domain focal, and the domain value focal are necessary. Why they are needed and how they are used in the focal solution will be in next session. If you remember in the previous session we had a discussion about the representation of the focal logical model. And you can see that we are sharing the focal for attribute. We can also add the physical representation of the focal implementation. And now we can see how we get model lineage. From one of the maybe a business information model through a focal logical representation of the business model and how that is its turn is physically implemented into the data warehouse. Later in this session I will show you with an example. So by accessing the metadata layer, You can, via a simple SQL statement, see how a business information model have been implemented physically. Sometimes you come up to a company or a client that want to build a data warehouse, and they already have a rich business information model, and they want to use that one to implement the data warehouse. With your focal solution, you can do then is to import the business information model into the metadata layer, into the semantic part. The other step is that we need to focalize that business information model. We need to go through the 5 focal forms. But one thing is very specific here. You don't have to do the whole model at once. There's no need to model everything, only what is needed at a specific sprint or such. Since the focal model and its implementation pattern is very agile with very little destructive change, because of this, we can expand the model in iterations without building or rebuilding any code or change, and sometimes we don't even need to add structures to add more data. So with a focal approach, you can take one of these big business information model and just implement by requirement after requirement. If we take the loan model as an example, and we see it as a business information model, we can see that in the business information model it has two different tables, the main loan table and the loan risk table. These are logical constructs. Now, if we do one example of these, we can see how we, from a conceptual view, capture this model. First, we set what model. In this case, it's the business information model of the company. We capture one of the entities, loan risk, and that is related to the business information model. And one of the attributes, the risk category, that is then of course related to the entity where it exists in the loan risk entity. The risk category has its own domain, risk category, and the valid values that this domain can have is low, medium, and high. Remember that each domain value is its own instance or key of data that we can add descriptive data about. So in the relationship between the domain focal and the domain value focal, there are 3 rows, 1 row per domain value. Let's take another example. The entity main loan has an attribute called loan currency, and that attribute is using the domain ISO 4217 that represents ISO currency codes. And in the example, we show 2 different currency codes, Euro and USD. And those belongs to the ISO currency code domain. If you would have another attribute that represents currency in some other context, and that domain attribute also uses the domain ISO currency code, it will reuse the same domain. This is an example where we can see one attribute, risk category, from the business information model. If you look at the attribute focal, we have risk category as a name representing the instance of data. If we now do a focal logical model that is based on the BIM model and the example of risk category, we can see that we have designated the risk category attribute to the descriptor concept classification, or CL in short. And it has its atomic context, risk category. The attribute is from the BIM model. It is sort of reused for the focal representation. in the metadata. So you can, through a simple SQL, see how the business information been represented in the focal logical model. If we now also add the physical mapping that we discussed in the previous session, you can then see how the business information model became physically implemented in the data warehouse. You are getting a model lineage in the metadata that can be used for all kinds of things. We also document source models in the metadata. In the example we're looking at, we have a system called calls, the core loan system. We say that the system represents its model. It sends CSV files to the data warehouse at a daily basis. One of the files contains loan information and is called calls loan. And we can see that as in the white entity above us with the attribute that belongs within it and what the primary key is of that file. In that file there is a field that is called rcat, which has its own domain rcat. And that domain can take on the values 1, 2, or 3. This way, the focal metadata layer and its semantic model can describe all integration to the data warehouse from a semantic perspective. But we also document integration against sources in the technical part of the metadata layer. But then we focus more on technical aspect and batch-oriented information. In the next session, we will look on how this information, both from the BIM and the focal point of view, and the source is used to represent semantic integration in the focal data warehouse. Thank you.